The order to attack came at the 9th bell, and Oku Senat watched the human fleet enter the war zone the way a sick man watches a door open in the dark. She was not a soldier. She was a quarantine officer of the Pale Increase, 3rd grade, and her whole life had been spent on the cordon station called Threshold Vault, far out on the edge where the Empire kept its sickest things. She measured rot, she labeled it, she decided which infected hulls were still useful, and which had gone too soft to fight. That was her work, and she was good at it. And on the morning the humans came, she was standing in the long observation gallery with a reading slate in her hands, expecting nothing. The frontier was supposed to be quiet. The Pale Increase had not lost a border world in 1100 years. The Empire did not win battles so much as it spread, the way damp spreads through a wall, and by the time a galaxy noticed the Increase was inside it, it was already too late. They called it the graying out past the cordon, in the worlds that still had names. The gray came, and the gray stayed, and the gray was patient. Threshold Vault sat at the very lip of the Empire, the last hard station before the open dark, and Oku had been posted there for 22 years. It was not a punishment posting, though many treated it as one. To the quarantine service, it was the most important station in the Increase, because it was the door, the place where new hulls came in from freshly eaten worlds to be measured and sorted before they were folded into the cordon proper. Every conscripted ship in the near reach had passed under Oka's slate at one time or another. She had laid her hand on their cold-grown skin. She had read the dying remnants of whatever crews still flickered inside them, and she had decided, by a number she alone was trusted to assign, whether a hull was still strong enough to serve, or whether it had gone too soft and should be sent to the rendering bays to be melted down for new growth. It was, she had always told herself, mercy work. A soft hull was a hull in pain. Better to end it cleanly than to leave it half-drowned. She had believed that for 22 years, the way you believe a thing you have to believe in order to keep doing your job. The station around her was beautiful, in the way the Increase made things beautiful. Pale and smooth and faintly warm, grown rather than built, its long galleries curving like the inside of a shell. The walls were soft to the touch. At night, they gave off a low light, the color of old bone, and the watch officers said the station dreamed, and they were not entirely joking. Everything the Increase made was a little alive. That was the genius of the gray, and the horror of it both. It did not build with dead metal, it built with the living, and it never asked. So when the watch officers began to call out numbers, Ak did not look up at once. She had heard panic before. She had heard it the way a doctor hears a cough. Then the count reached 40, and she looked up, because 40 human hulls had folded out of the dark in 9 seconds, and that was not a number anyone on Threshold Vault had a procedure for. They came in a line. That was the first wrong thing. The Increase did not fight in lines. The Increase fought as a smear, a tide of grown and conscripted hulls that fell on a target from every angle at once and dissolved it. A line was a thing made by hands. A line meant decision. A line meant that somewhere in each of those 40 ships, someone had chosen exactly where it would be, down to the meter, and held it there. Oku counted the hulls a second time to be sure. 40. Lean gray shapes, longer than the cordon's biggest devourer, with no growths on them, and no spores, and no soft pulsing skin. Hard metal. Clean edges, old scars worn smooth, the way a stone in a river is worn smooth, so that you knew these ships had been hit 1,000 times and had never once been opened. On the leading hull, 3 letters had been cut into the prow and filled with something that caught the dead light of the frontier and threw it back white. She did not know the human script. The translator on her slate found it after a moment and gave her the sound of it, and the sound meant nothing to her, and she would spend the rest of her life unable to forget it. The fleet had a name. The translator gave her that too, in a flat little voice. The humans called it the Sunderline. The flagship at its head, the one with the 3 white letters, was the long account. OK wrote both names on her slate, because writing things down was what she did when she was afraid. Then she set the slate down, because her hands had started to shake, and she did not want the watch to see. Around her the gallery had gone loud. Overseer Vetch Sorum had come up from the war deck, his pale crest flat against his skull, and he was giving the order that the cordon had drilled for 1,000 years. Engulf. Surround the intruders. Let the gray take them. 40 hulls were nothing. The cordon held 2,000 devourers in its near reach alone, grown fat on 100 eaten worlds, and behind them stood the deep reserve, and behind that stood the increase itself, which had never in its long life met a thing it could not soften and absorb. 2,000 against 40. Auk had spent her career certain of one law above all others. Numbers won. Mass won. The Grey always won. Because the Grey did not need to be brave, it only needed to be more. She had taught that law to younger officers. She had carved it into them, the way the increase carved its will into the worlds it ate. When a thing is alone, you do not need to defeat it. You only need to be everywhere it is, and wait, and it will come apart in your hands. That was the whole strategy of the Empire. That was the only strategy it had ever needed. It had no admirals worth the name, no grand tacticians, no schools of war, because it had never required them. It had the Grey, and the Grey was enough. Oko looked down at the war deck below the gallery and watched the cordon begin to move. The near reach of devourers loosened from their docking blooms, like something pulling free of mud. 2,000 of them. She had inspected many with her own hands, and she knew what was inside them, and that knowing was the part of her job she never spoke about, not even to herself. There had been a hull, once, 19 years back, a devourer that came in from a world called Seren, a small green world the cordon had taken in a single season. Oki had been young then, 2nd grade, and she had gone aboard the new hull to do the measuring, and somewhere deep in the folded skin of it, she had found a flicker that would not go quiet under her hand, the way the others did. A small, persistent flicker. A child, the readings said, though the readings were never supposed to say such things. She had stood there in the warm, dim belly of the ship, with her hand on the wall, and the flicker had pushed against her palm, faint and frightened and still trying, after the whole world it came from was already gray, and Okyu had done the thing the 2nd grade was trained to do. She had assigned the hull its number. She had marked it fit for service. She had filed the report that called the child gone, and she had walked off the ship and gone home, and not slept. And in the morning, she had told herself the flicker had been a fault in the readings, and she had believed it, because she had to. She had never told anyone about Surin. She had carried it for 19 years, the way you carry a stone you swallowed by accident, lodged somewhere it cannot be reached, and on most days, she did not feel it at all, and on a few days, she felt nothing else. Each devourer had once been a ship of someone else. Long ago, when the world it came from was eaten, the Grey had not melted the survivors down. It had folded them inward. It had taken the crews and the colonists and the children and pressed them into the walls of their own vessels, into the soft new skin the spores grew over the metal, and it kept them there, half awake, dreaming the dream the increase fed them. The dream was simple. You are part of something now. You were always meant to be part of something. Be still, and be many, and do not remember the word you used to call yourself. That was what flew toward the human line. 2,000 drowned crews wearing their own ships like coffins, steered by a hunger that was not their own. Oku Senat knew all of this, and she had made her peace with it the way the 3rd grade made peace with everything, by labeling it and filing it and going home at the end of the shift. She told herself the folded ones were gone. She told herself there was nobody left inside to save. She had to tell herself that, because the alternative did not let a person sleep. She believed that law completely, right up until the moment the human fleet did the one thing the pale increase had no answer for. It did not speed up. It did not open fire. It did not even raise its shields against the tide already turning to meet it. It simply began to broadcast, across every channel the cordon owned, on every frequency the infected hulls used to whisper to one another. On the deep low band, the increase thought was its own secret. The Sunderline began to speak. And the first thing Oku Senat felt, before she understood a single word of it, was the 2,000 devourers around her go suddenly, completely still. Not dead, not slowed. Still, the way a room goes still when someone says a name that everybody in it has been trying very hard to forget. Overseer Vetch Sorum shouted the engulf order a second time. Down on the war deck, the spore conductors slammed their hands against the wet command panels and pushed. Nothing moved. The Grey did not surge. The tide that had begun to gather around the human line simply hung there. 2,000 hulls drifting. while the long account spoke and would not stop. Aqua found that she had picked her slate back up. The translator was running. It was struggling, dropping words, catching them again. The humans were not threatening anyone. They were not demanding surrender. There was no fury in the voice at all, and that absence frightened her more than fury would have. The long account was reading a list. It was reading names, world after world after world, each one spoken slow and clear, and after each world a date, and after each date, a single short phrase the translator rendered the same way every time. Eaten by the pale increase. Eaten by the pale increase. Eaten by the pale increase. Eaton had labeled hulls from 100 of those worlds. She heard a name she knew, a world called Seren, that she had personally surveyed 19 years ago, and her hand opened, and the slate fell, and she did not pick it up again. Below her, one of the 2,000 devourers shuddered. Just one. A long ripple ran down its gray skin, and somewhere deep in its hull, a light came on, that no cordon ship was ever supposed to show. A small white light, the kind a person turns on when they wake in the night and cannot remember where they are. Then a second hull lit, then a third. The humans had not fired a shot, the battle had not begun, and the pale increase, for the first time in 1100 years, was beginning to come apart from the inside before its enemy had so much as raised a gun. Vetch Sorum did not understand what was happening, and so he did the only thing a creature of the increase knew how to do when it did not understand. He reached for more. He called the deep reserve. Past the near 2,000, in the long dark bays carved into the back of the cordon, the Empire kept its oldest devourers, the ones grown so large and so dense that they were no longer counted as ships, but as moving fortresses. 6 of them. Each one held the folded crews of 40 worlds. Each one could swallow a moon. They had not moved in 200 years, because nothing had ever come to the frontier that was worth waking them for. Vetch woke all 6. Oku felt it in the floor before she heard it. A slow, grinding pressure as the back of the station opened, and the 6 great shapes pulled themselves out of their sleep. The gray skin of them was so thick it had gone almost black, scarred with the marks of worlds that had tried to fight back and failed. Around her, the watch officers made a sound she had never heard them make, a low, awed hum, the sound her people made in the presence of the Empire's true power. 6 fortresses. 8,000 folded crews, against 40 clean gray hulls in a line. The long account kept reading names. Oku watched the 6 fortresses move toward the human line, and she waited for the moment the law of the gray would reassert itself. The moment mass would do what mass always did. She told herself the broadcast was a trick, a delaying noise, that any heartbeat now, the humans would break and run, and the cordon would fall on them, and that would be that. She wanted it to happen. She was a daughter of the increase. She had eaten her share of worlds without ever once lifting a hand, simply by signing the labels that let the gray move forward. She did not want the Empire to fall. But she was also a quarantine officer, and a quarantine officer's whole discipline is to look at a sick thing and tell the truth about it, no matter how much the truth costs. And the truth standing in front of her was that the human fleet was not afraid. She had spent her life among frightened things, frightened crews, frightened worlds, frightened officers who hid it under crests held high. She knew fear the way she knew rot, by its smell, by the small tells it left, and there was none of it in the line of 40. The ships held their spacing to the meter. The voice on the broadcast did not rise or shake. When the 6 fortresses came on, the Sunder line did not so much as adjust its formation. It simply absorbed the new threat into the same calm it had shown the first 2,000, as if 6 waking gods were a thing it had planned for and crossed off a list before the morning began. That was when Oko understood the second wrong thing, the deeper one. The humans had not come to the frontier by accident. They had not stumbled into the cordon. They had chosen this place, this station, this exact reach of the dark, and they had chosen it because the pale increase kept its worst secret here, in the folded crews of 2,000 and 8,000 drowned ships, and the humans had built a fleet specifically to walk into the heart of that secret and say its name out loud. While the fortresses came on, Oku did a thing she would not have been able to explain. She left the gallery rail and crossed to the near dock, where a single small devourer had pulled in not 3 days before, freshly arrived from a world she had not yet processed. It was the last hull she had personally received, and it was still sealed, still waiting for her number, and as the broadcast washed over the cordon, she found she needed to put her hand on it. The skin of the small hull was warm under her palm, the way they all were, and as she stood there, the long account's list of names reached a world she did not know, a place called Veshan Fall, and somewhere in the hull beneath her hand, a flicker woke. Not the dying remnant she was used to, the faint thing she always filed as gone. Awaking. The flicker pushed up against her palm the way the child of Suren had pushed 19 years ago, except this time it did not stop. It grew. The wall under her hand grew warmer, and then a small white light bloomed beneath the skin, exactly where her fingers rested, and Senat felt, through the living wall of the ship, a single distinct person come awake, and remember, all at once, that it had been somebody, and that the somebody had a name. She snatched her hand back as if burned, but she had felt it. After 22 years of calling them gone, she had laid her hand on a hull and felt one of the gone come back, and there was no number on her slate for what that did to her. The first fortress reached the human line at the 11th bell. It did not get to strike. As it closed the last distance, the broadcast changed. Oku's translator stumbled, then steadied, and what came through was no longer a list of worlds. It was a single name, repeated, and it was not a human name, it was one of theirs. It was a name in the old tongue of a world called Heth, a world the Increase had eaten so long ago that even Oku had only seen it in the deep archive, and the name belonged to a person, one person, a shipwright of Heth, who had died folded into the wall of her own vessel 400 years past. The Sunderline said her name, and then it said what she had built, and the street she had lived on, and the color of the sea she had grown up beside, and it said all of this, not to the watching empire, but to the fortress itself, to the 8,000 folded souls inside it, in their own languages, in the names their mothers had given them, faster than Oko could follow, a flood of remembering aimed like a weapon at the one thing the gray could not allow. The first fortress stopped. It stopped the way a great animal stops when it is struck through the heart, all its forward weight still carrying it on, but the life going out of it. The black-gray skin rippled and split, and from the splits came light, white light, thousands of small white lights, as deep inside the fortress, the folded crews of 40 worlds heard their own names, for the first time in 400 years, and remembered, all at once, that they had ever had names at all. Oku Senat had inspected those hulls. She had labeled them as gone. She watched, now, as the gone came back. The fortress did not fire on the humans. It turned, slow, enormous, grinding against itself, 8,000 wills no longer pulling in one direction, but in 8,000. The great hull fought itself, and the part of it that was the Increase tried to hold the helm, and the part of it that was 40 remembered worlds tried to take the helm away. And the part that remembered won. The fortress turned its blunt, scarred face away from the human line and toward the cordon that had made it, toward Threshold Vault, toward the deep bays where its 5 sleeping brothers were still pulling themselves awake, and it began, very deliberately, to accelerate. On the war deck, Vetch Sorum finally understood, and he began to scream orders that no longer mattered. Oku stood very still in the gallery and watched the Empire's own weapon come home. Oku watched the freed fortress turn, and she heard, for the first time, what a freed hull sounded like when it found its voice. It came across the open bands, ragged and overlapping, 8,000 voices all speaking at once, after 400 years of silence, and at first, it was only noise. Then the noise resolved, the way a crowd resolves when you stand among it long enough, into individual things, a voice counting children, over and over, as if checking they were all still there. A voice saying a single name and then weeping. A voice asking, very calmly and very reasonably, whether anyone could tell it how long it had been, because it had been keeping count, and had reached 400 years, and was afraid the count was wrong. And under all of it, threaded through every voice, the names. The freed could not stop saying their names. They said them the way a person who has been very cold says the word warm, over and over, just to feel it in the mouth. Oku had spent 22 years certain that the folded were gone. She had built her whole life on that certainty. and she stood in the trembling gallery and listened to 8,000 of the gone speak their own names, and the certainty came apart in her, the way the fortress had come apart, all its forward weight still carrying it on, but the life of it going out, and something new and unbearable taking its place. The first fortress drove itself into the second, which was still half asleep, still uncertain, and the impact was not a battle. It was a waking. Where the freed hull touched the sleeping one, the broadcast's work spread by contact, name to name, soul to soul, and the second fortress shuddered and lit, and began to remember too. Two of them now, turned against the dark that had drowned them. Then the third. The gray had built its strength by folding worlds together into one mind, and the humans had simply found the seam where the folding never quite held, and pressed it. And now the Empire's great unity was running backward through its own fleet, like a crack through ice. The near 2,000 were already drifting, already lit with their small white lights, already waking. Now the fortresses woke them faster. The whole cordon, the entire gray mass that had held the frontier for 1,100 years, was turning into something the increase had no word for, because it had never imagined it could happen. Its ships were remembering they were people, and the human fleet had still not fired a single shot. Okju became aware that Overseer Vetch was looking at her. He had stopped screaming. He stood at the rail of the war deck with his crest gone, the white of true terror, and he was looking up at the gallery, at the quarantine officers, at her, because in the whole panicking station, the quarantine officers were the only ones whose job was to understand contamination, and what was eating his empire was a contamination he had no protocol for. He climbed the gallery stairs. He came to her because her grade was stamped on her collar, and she happened to be nearest the rail. He took her by the shoulder with a hand that was shaking, and he asked her the question that overseers were never supposed to ask the third grade. He asked her how to stop it. There was a moment, then, that Oku remembered with perfect clarity for the rest of her life. Vetch Sorum was not a kind creature. He had ordered worlds folded with a flick of his crest. He had stood in this very gallery and watched the rendering bays melt down soft hulls full of half-living crews, and had complained that the process was too slow. He was the empire made flesh, the fear that ruled it, given a body and a rank. And in that moment, with his hand shaking on her shoulder, and his crest gone the white of terror, Okuk saw that he was, underneath all of it, exactly as drowned as the souls in the hulls outside. He had been folded too. Not into a ship, into a role. He had been pressed down into being the overseer, until there was nothing left of whatever he had been before, and he had served the rot so completely that he had become a piece of it, and he was as much a prisoner of the gray as the child of Surin had ever been. She felt no pity for him. That would come later, for the others, but she saw him clearly, for the first time, and seeing him clearly was its own kind of answer to his question, though not one he could have understood. Oku Senat looked at him. She looked at the freed fortresses turning in the dark, at the 2,000 drifting hulls coming awake one by one, at the calm gray line of 40 human ships that had walked into the heart of the Empire and broken it with a list of names. And for the first time in her long, careful life, the quarantine officer told an overseer of the pale increase the exact and complete truth. She told him it could not be stopped. She told him it had never been a weapon they could shoot, because it was not aimed at the ships. It was aimed at what the ships used to be, and you could not unkill a memory once it had woken, any more than you could refold a thing that had decided to remember its own name. The humans had not brought a fleet to destroy the cordon. They had brought a fleet to free it, and the freeing was the destruction, and there was no defense against being told the truth, except to never have lied in the first place, and the increase had been lying for 1,100 years. Vetch Sorum did not take it well. He ordered her arrested. There were no guards left who would do it, because the guards were watching their own world's ghosts wake up in the hulls outside, and had stopped taking orders. He ordered the station's own gray to engulf the gallery, to silence the broadcast at the source, and the station's gray did not answer either, because the station itself was grown, and somewhere in its walls were folded the crews of the world threshold vault had been built over, and they had heard the names too. The lights in the walls of the station began to come on, small, white, everywhere. Oku felt the floor under her feet change. Threshold vault was waking up. She should have been afraid, Part of her was. But a larger part. A part she had kept folded away inside herself for 19 years, ever since she had surveyed the world called Seren, and labeled its drowned ships as gone and gone forever. That larger part felt something she did not have a clean word for, something that was almost the opposite of fear, and she stood in the trembling gallery and let it rise. Below, Vetch Sorum drew the old weapon every overseer carried, the spore lance, the thing the increase used to fold a body where it stood, and he turned it on the broadcast relay, on the panels, on anything, firing wildly into his own dying station. It did nothing. You cannot fold a thing that is busy unfolding. The lance flared and spat, and the white lights only spread. And then the long account, the lead ship of the Sunderline, the one with the 3 white letters cut into its prow, did the second thing the pale increase had no answer for. It hailed Threshold Vault directly, not the broadcast, not the list of names, a direct channel, station to ship, the kind of call one captain makes to another. Oku's slate caught it where it had fallen on the floor, and she bent and picked it up and listened, because she could not have done anything else. A human voice came through, older than she expected. A woman's voice, level and unhurried, the voice of someone who has done a hard thing many times and has stopped needing to raise it. The voice gave a name. The captain of the long account was called Mara Veld, and she said so plainly, the way you give your name to a stranger you intend to deal with honestly. Then Captain Mara Veld of the human fleet said that she was not speaking to the increase. She was speaking past it. She said she knew there were still people on Threshold Vault who had been born into the gray and had never once been given a choice. And she was offering them one now, the first real choice of their lives. She said the humans would not fire on the station. She said they had not crossed the dark to kill the children of the people the increase had drowned. She said the fleet would hold its line, and read its names, and wait, and that anyone aboard the station who wished to stop being a thing the Empire owned, needed only to do one thing. They needed only to stop helping it. The channel closed. Oku Senat stood in the gallery of a station that was waking up around her, holding a slate that had just offered her a choice she had spent her whole life pretending did not exist, and she looked down at Overseer Vetch Sorum firing his useless lance into the walls, and she made it. She set the slate down, gently this time. She walked to the master relay at the head of the gallery, the one the quarantine officers used to flag contaminated hulls for destruction, the one piece of the station that could still reach every ship in the near reach with a single command. Vetch saw her move and shouted at her to stop. She did not stop. Her hands were steady now, steadier than they had been in years. She keyed in her own authorization, 3rd grade, quarantine, the codes she had used 10,000 times to mark drowned worlds as gone, and she used them, for the first and last time, to do the opposite. She flagged every hull in the cordon not as contaminated, but as crew. She opened the deep bands the increase thought were its secret, the ones the humans were already speaking on, and she added the station's own voice to theirs, the full quarantine archive, every name of every folded world she had ever filed and labeled and lied about. 400 years of the Empire's drowned, poured out at once into the dark for the ships to hear. The whole cordon woke at the same instant. Behind her, Vetch Sorum made one last sound, and then the walls of the station, which were grown, which were gray, which were full of folded crews who had just heard their own names, closed gently around the place where their overseer stood, and the lance went silent, and the white lights came on in the gallery one by one, until Oku Senat stood alone, in a quiet, bright room, at the edge of an empire that had just stopped being able to hold its own ships together. Outside, the Sunderline held its line, exactly where it had been since the 9th bell. 40 clean gray hulls, not a shot fired. The battle that the whole frontier had braced for had simply never started, because by the time the two fleets were close enough to fight, one of them had remembered it had never wanted to be a fleet at all. Oku looked out at the human ships, at the 3 white letters on the prow of the long account, and she finally asked her own slate to tell her what they meant. The translator gave her the word. It was the name of the dead world the human fleet had come from. The world the increase had eaten so long ago that it was not even in the deep archive, the first world the gray ever drowned, the one nobody was supposed to remember. The word was Earth. The pale increase did not die when its cordon woke. Empires that have ruled for 1100 years do not die from a single broken frontier. They have a center, and the center had felt the cordon go quiet, and the center was old and patient and very, very afraid. Oku learned this the way she learned everything now, by watching her freed slate as it pulled in signals she had never been allowed to hear. From the deep core of the empire, 3 light days inward, a new thing was stirring. The translator did not have a word for it. The cordon's freed crews had a word, an old word, whispered now between the waking hulls, and it was the word the eaten worlds had used for the thing at the center of the gray, the first thing, the mouth that all the spores grew out of. They called it the sovereign rot, and it was coming. Oku had never believed in the sovereign rot the way the lower orders did. To the 3rd grade it was a fairy story, a thing the field spores prayed to, but she watched the readings climb on her slate, and she understood that the fairy story was real, and it was a fleet, the true fleet of the increase, the one the Empire had never needed to use because the gray had always been enough. The translator finally counted it. 11,000 hulls, not devourers, not the soft conscripted ships of eaten worlds. These were grown deliberately, from the Empire's own substance, the oldest and purest gray, and they had no folded crews inside them, because they had no crews at all. They were extensions of the center itself, 11,000 fingers of one ancient drowning mind, and against them, the human trick would not work, because you cannot remind a thing of a self it never had. Oku felt the cold of it settle into her. The cordon was free, the 2,000 and the 8,000 had woken, but all of that had been the easy part, the soft outer rot, and now the Empire was sending its hard center, and the hard center had nothing to remember, and nothing to free, and nothing to lose. She did the only thing she could think to do. She opened a channel to the human fleet, stationed to ship, the same way Captain Maraveld had opened one to her. She did not know if they would answer a quarantine officer of the people they had come to fight. She gave her name anyway, the way the captain had. Oku Senat, 3rd grade, of Threshold Vault. And she told them what was coming, the count, the nature of it, that the trick would not bite on the sovereign rot, that the center had no folded crews to wake. The channel was quiet for a moment, then the level voice of Maraveld came back, and the human captain thanked her, by name, the way a person thanks another person, and then she said something Oko turned over for the rest of her life. She said the fleet already knew. She said the Sunderline had not come to the frontier to free the cordon. The cordon was on the way. The cordon was the first 800 meters of a much longer road, and the road led inward, to the center, to the sovereign rot, because the humans had not built a fleet to win a border skirmish. They had built it to end the thing that drowned their world, and they had always known the end of that road was the center, and they had always known the center could not be freed. So they would not free it. They would do the other thing. Oku asked what the other thing was. Maraveld did not answer in words. She told Oku to watch, and to keep her station's crews clear of the line of fire, and then the channel closed, and the Sunderline began, for the first time since it had entered the war zone, to move. It did not move the way the gray moved. It did not smear or surge. The 40 hulls of the human fleet folded forward in a single clean step, leaving the freed cordon behind them, and they set their prows toward the deep core, where the 11,000 fingers of the sovereign rot were rising, and they held their line, and they accelerated, and Oku Senat understood that she was about to watch 40 ships walk straight into the throat of the oldest power in the galaxy. She should have stayed on the station. There was no reason for a quarantine officer to follow, but the cordon was hers now. In a way, the freed crews looking to the one voice that had spoken for them, and there were 800 waking ships that did not yet know how to be free, and they needed a direction, and the only direction that made any sense at all was the one the human fleet had chosen. So Oku Senat did the most reckless thing of her careful life. She took command of Threshold Vault, which was no longer a cordon station, but a waking thing full of newly remembered souls, and she turned its blunt gray mass inward, and she followed the Sunderline toward the center, and behind her, slow and uncertain and bright with 10,000 small white lights, the freed cordon came too. She was not a soldier. She kept telling herself that, as the slate filled with the rising signature of the sovereign rot. She was a quarantine officer. She measured rot and labeled it. But perhaps, she thought, that was exactly the right training for what was coming. because the thing at the center of the Empire was the largest contaminated hull she would ever inspect, and someone had to be willing to look at it and tell the truth. The freed cordon that came behind her was not an army, and she had to learn quickly how to lead a thing that was not an army. 10,000 newly woken ships, each one full of souls who had been asleep for centuries, and had woken into bodies of metal and gray, frightened, disoriented, many of them still half-folded, the waking incomplete. They did not know how to fly themselves. They did not know how to be separate after so long as part of one thing. Some of them drifted in circles, some of them stopped entirely, and had to be coaxed forward, name by name, by the ones who had woken first. Oki found herself doing the gentlest work of her life, moving threshold vault from hull to hull, putting the station's voice alongside the frightened ones, telling them where they were, and what had happened, and that they were free, and that free was a thing you could learn to be, slowly, the way you learn to walk after a long illness. She understood, doing it, why the human fleet went ahead and did not wait for the freed to follow. The freed were not soldiers either. They were survivors, and you did not throw survivors at the center of an empire. You put yourself between them and the danger, and you went first, and you let them come at their own pace. And the Sunderline did exactly that. 40 hulls always ahead, always between the waking cordon and whatever the increase sent next, taking the weight of the road, so that the freed behind them only had to learn how to live again. Oki had been told her whole life that the humans were monsters. She had never been told they were gentle. It was the gentleness that undid her, in the end. Anyone can be told a story of monsters. It takes a fleet of monsters to win a galaxy. It takes something else entirely to win it. By going first, and reading names, and never once asking the people you are saving to bleed for their own rescue. The road inward was not empty. Between the broken cordon and the deep core, the increase had built 3 more rings of defense over the centuries, each one larger and harder than the last, and the Sunderline had to cross all 3 to reach the center. Oki followed at the distance Maraveld had named, and she watched the human fleet meet each ring in turn, and what she saw she carried with her always, because it taught her the things she had been most wrong about. The first ring was the inward cull, 4,000 devourers grown specifically to guard the road, fed on the worlds the increase considered most dangerous, the ones that had fought back hardest before they fell. These were not soft hulls. They were the Empire's veterans, if the Grey could be said to have veterans, and they fell on the human line in a fury that Oku had never seen the cordon manage. 4,000 at once, a wall of gray teeth closing on 40. The Sunderline read their names. That was all. It did not break formation. It did not raise its guns. It simply found, in the deep archive it carried, the names of the 4,000 worlds that had fought back hardest, and it spoke them, and the inward cull, which had been made out of exactly those worlds because they fought back hardest, woke fastest of all, because a soul that fought once will fight again the moment it remembers it was ever a soul. The fury that had been aimed at the human line turned inward in an instant, 4,000 veterans remembering at once what they were, and the first ring did not so much break as detonate into freedom, and the human fleet passed through the gap it tore in itself without slowing by a single meter. The second ring tried to be clever. It did not charge. The increase had learned, in the hour since the cordon fell, that charging only spread the waking faster, and so the second ring held back, a wall of 6,000 hulls that simply stood across the road and refused to come close, hoping to bar the way without ever touching the thing that woke them. It did not matter. The broadcast did not need contact. The human fleet held its line and read its names, and the names crossed the gap on their own, the way light crosses a room, and the second ring woke standing still, 6,000 souls coming back to themselves where they stood, and they opened the road themselves, gladly, and turned their guns at last not on the humans, but on the third ring behind them. Aku had spent her life certain that the Grey's great strength was its mass. She understood now that its mass was its great weakness, because every hull the Empire added to itself was one more place the truth could get in, one more drowned soul waiting to be reminded, and the larger the increase grew, the more flammable it became, until the day a fleet arrived that knew how to strike the spark. The Empire had spent 1,100 years building a galaxy of kindling and calling it an army. The two forces met at the edge of the core. The sovereign rot did not speak. It had never needed words. It simply unfolded, the 11,000 pure gray hulls spreading into a wall across the dark, a wall with no seams, and no names, and no folded crews. A wall that was all one thing, the way the Empire had always wanted everything to be. And against that wall the 40 ships of the Sunder Line looked like nothing at all. 40 against 11,000. The old law of the gray. Mass wins. Mass always wins. Oku held Threshold Vault back at the distance Maraveld had named, and she watched, and she waited for the human fleet to die. It did not die. When the Sovereign Rot struck, it struck with the full weight of the center, 11,000 hulls falling on 40 all at once, and the 40 did not break. The clean gray ships of Earth held their line, and where the gray touched them, it did not engulf them, because the human hulls were not soft, and were not afraid, and had no seam in them anywhere for the rot to grip. Oku had inspected 10,000 hulls in her life, and she had never seen one like these. They were not grown. They were built, every plate set by a hand that had decided exactly where it would go, and the difference between a grown thing and a built thing is that a built thing can be made without a single weakness, if the hands that make it care enough, and the hands that made the Sunder Line had cared more than Oku had words for. The gray broke on them like water on stone, and only then, with 11,000 hulls breaking uselessly against its line, did the human fleet open fire for the first time. Oku's slate could not properly show it. The light was too much. 40 ships fired as one, not in panic, not in spray, but in a single coordinated stroke, each gun finding the exact place in the wall where the Sovereign Rot was thickest, where the center had pulled the most of itself together, and the human fire did not scatter the wall. It bored through it. A road of light opened straight into the heart of the 11,000, clean and narrow and absolute, and down that road the Sunder Line poured everything it had. The Sovereign Rot felt it. For the first time in 1100 years, the center of the pale increase felt something reach all the way inside it, and Oka, watching, heard the thing make a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a mind makes when it discovers, far too late, that being one enormous thing means that a single road, driven to your heart, kills all of you at once. The gray had built its strength on unity. The humans had simply turned that unity into a single target. Oku had spent her whole life being told that the increase could not be fought, and she had believed it, because every force that had ever tried had been swallowed. She understood now why they had failed, and the humans had not. The others had fought the gray the way you fight an army. They had aimed at the hulls, at the mass, at the body of the thing, and the body of the thing was endless, and so they had drowned. The humans did not aim at the body. They had looked at the Empire for 400 years, until they understood that all of its endless body was hung on a single thread, one will, one fear, gathered at the center, and that everything else was only that one thread wearing 10 million bodies. So they did not fight the bodies, they cut the thread. And when you cut the thread, all 10 million bodies fall at once, because they were never really alive on their own. They were only the places the thread had spread itself to hide. That was the whole secret of the war, and it was a secret hidden in plain sight, written in the very name the Empire used for itself. The increase, a thing that grows by adding, that is strong because it is more. The humans had simply asked the question no one else had thought to ask. If a thing is strong because it is one large thing, then what happens to all of it if you reach the one place it is most itself, and end it there? And the answer was the thing Oko was watching now. All of it ended, all at once. Oko watched the road of light hold open in the wall of 11,000, and she watched the human guns work, and she noticed a thing about them that she had no frame for. They did not fire more than they needed. Every other force she had ever seen, the rare ones that tried to fight the increase, fired in panic, threw everything they had at the gray, and were swallowed anyway. The Sunder Line did not. It fired exactly as much as the task required, and not one stroke more, the way a surgeon cuts, and between strokes it held its fire entirely, and read more names, because the guns were never the point. The guns only opened the door, the names did the rest. She thought of her own slate, of the careful, precise way she had spent her life measuring and labeling, assigning each hull exactly the number it deserved and no other. She had thought of that precision as a small, cold thing, a clerk's habit. She saw now that it was the same precision she was watching in the human guns, the same discipline, turned to the opposite purpose. The humans had taken the cold exactness of a record keeper and made it into the deadliest fleet in the galaxy, because in the end, the war against the increase was not a war of force. It was a war of bookkeeping. It was won by whoever kept the truer record, and the humans had kept theirs for 400 years. Every name, every world, every date, and they had come to the frontier to collect. The sovereign rot did not die quietly, and it did not die quickly, because a thing that has ruled for 1100 years has more than one heart. When the road of human fire reached the place where the center had gathered itself, the wall of 11,000 hulls convulsed, and then it did something Oku had not believed the Grey could do. It let go of itself. The sovereign rot abandoned the 11,000 bodies it had spread into, and pulled all of its mind backward, deeper into the core, into a single hidden vessel that no reading on Oku's slate had shown, because it had been buried under the whole mass of the empire, the way the smallest spore is buried at the center of the largest rot. The 11,000 hulls, suddenly empty of the will that drove them, went limp and dark and drifted, and through the gap they left the human fleet drove inward, and Oko followed, because she had come this far and she would not turn back now, and behind her the freed cordon came too, 10,000 waking ships chasing the trail of light into the deepest dark any of them had ever flown. What they found at the true center stopped them all. It was a world, not a ship. A world, or what had been one, the first world the Grey had ever eaten, 1100 years and more ago, and the sovereign rot had never moved on from it. It had stayed. It had wrapped itself around its first kill, and grown out of it like fungus from a buried thing, and the whole empire, every devourer, every fortress, every folded crew, was nothing but the spreading body of one single rot that still sat, after all this time, on the corpse of the planet where it had been born. Wakwa's slate found the old name of the dead world in the deep archive. She read it, and then she read the survey record attached to it, the founding record, the oldest file the quarantine service kept, and she understood the last and worst truth of the day, the one the human fleet had known all along, and had been kind enough not to say. The first world the Grey ever ate had not been a stranger to her people. It had been her people. The pale increase had not come from outside. It had begun, 1100 years ago, as one species' decision to stop being many small frightened things and become one large unafraid thing, to fold itself together and never be alone or weak again. And it had worked, and the folding had spread, and over the centuries, the thing that called itself the increase had eaten its way across the galaxy without ever once admitting that the very first crew it had drowned, the first souls it had pressed into the walls, had been its own. Oku Senat was descended from the survivors. Every officer of the cordon was. They were the children of the ones who had done the folding, and they had spent their whole lives serving the rot that their own ancestors had become, labeling the drowned and calling them gone, never knowing that the empire they served was simply the longest and largest act of a people too afraid to be themselves. The human fleet had known. Earth had been the first world the Grey ate from outside, the first stranger it drowned after it had finished drowning its own makers, and somewhere in the 400 years between then and now, the humans had learned the whole story, had pieced it together from the names in the dark, and had built a fleet not to conquer the increase, but to do the one thing the increase had spent 1100 years making impossible. To remind it of what it had been before it was afraid. Oku thought about that, holding her station back at the edge of the dead world, watching 40 clean gray hulls ring the corpse of the first folded planet. She had been raised to believe the human worlds hated the increase, that they were a vengeful thing come to burn the empire down. She saw now that the truth was both colder and warmer than hatred. The humans had studied the increase the way Oku studied a contaminated hull, patiently, completely, until they understood not just what it did, but why, and the why was the key to everything. The increase did what it did because, 1100 years ago, a frightened people had decided that being a self was too painful to bear. Every world it had drowned since was only that first frightened decision, repeating, forever, the way a single rotten thought repeats in a sleepless mind until dawn. And you do not cure that by burning. You cure it by going back to the first decision and undoing it, by finding the founders themselves, the ones who had voted yes in the founding council, and reminding them that the painful thing they had run from was the only thing that had ever made them real. The humans had not come to kill the increase. They had come to talk it out of existing, by talking its makers back into being people, and that was a far stranger and far harder weapon than any gun, and there was no defense against it at all. The sovereign rot, in its single hidden vessel, on the corpse of its first world, opened a channel. Oku had not expected it to. It had never spoken before, but it was dying, and the dying speak, and what came out of the center of the pale increase was not the voice of a monster. It was a chorus. Thousands of voices, the first folded crew, the makers, all of them still in there, still drowning, after 1100 years, and they spoke as one, because they had never been allowed to speak as anything else, and what they said to the human fleet was a question. They asked if it still hurt to be small. Oku would remember the answer for the rest of her life. Captain Maraveld of the long account did not gloat, and she did not hate. She answered the question the way you answer a frightened child who has done a terrible thing for a reason you understand. She said yes. She said it still hurt to be small, and to be alone, and to be afraid, and that it would always hurt, and that the hurt was not a sickness to be cured. It was the price of being a self. It was the proof of one. She said her people had paid that price every day for 400 years since their world was drowned, and they had never once thought of folding themselves together to make the hurt stop, because the hurt was theirs, and a thing that is yours is worth keeping even when it aches. Then she told the sovereign rot that she was not going to drown it the way it had drowned everyone else. She was going to do the harder thing. She was going to let it choose. The Sunderline did not fire on the center. It held its line, 40 hulls in a ring around the dead world and the dying rot, and the human fleet did the thing it had done at the very beginning, the thing it had crossed the whole galaxy to do. It read the names, not the names of the eaten worlds this time, the names of the makers, the first folded crew, the ones who had started it all, 1100 years of drowning, and the humans had learned every one of them, all 11,400 of the founders, from a record so old the increase itself had forgotten it kept it, and the long account spoke each name slow and clear into the center, and after each name, it said, not eaten by the pale increase, but something else. After each name it said, you can stop now. And one by one, in the deepest heart of the empire, on the corpse of the first world, the makers heard their own names for the first time in 1100 years, and remembered that they had once been people, and that being people had been worth the fear. The sovereign rot came apart. It did not explode, it did not burn, it simply stopped being one thing. The single hidden vessel split along 11,400 seams, one for every founder, and the light came out, white and small and everywhere, the same light Oku had watched wake in the cordon hours ago, and the oldest rot in the galaxy unfolded itself at last, and let its makers go. For a long moment, there was nothing but the lights. The dead world below, dark for 1100 years, lit from above by the unfolding of the thing that had killed it, and Oku Senat watched from the bridge of a station full of waking souls, and found that she was weeping, which the third grade was not supposed to do, and did not care. One of the freed makers spoke. Oku's slate caught it. A single voice pulled loose from the unfolding chorus, old beyond measure, the voice of one of the very first to fold, and so one of the very last to wake. The translator gave it to her slowly, struggling with a dialect, 1100 years dead. The maker said its name. Then it said it had been a builder of gardens. Before, it said it remembered, now, that it had been afraid, all those long centuries ago, of how small its people were, and how large the dark was, and it had stood in the founding council on the day the choice was made, and it had voted yes. It had voted to fold. It had believed, the way you believe a thing that lets you stop being afraid, that if they all became one great thing together, then nothing could ever frighten them again. And it had been right, in the most terrible way. After the folding, there had been no more fear, because there had been no more selves left to feel it. The garden builder said it had spent 1100 years inside the rot it helped to make, awake the whole time and unable to speak, watching the thing it had voted for eat world after world after world, and never once being able to say the one word it had wanted to say since the very first century. It said the word now, to the human fleet, to the freed cordon, to the whole listening dark. It said, sorry, And then it said the second thing, which Oku carried even longer than the first. It said it had stopped being afraid of being small on the day the human voice spoke its name, because a thing with a name is never truly alone, and a thing that is not truly alone does not need to fold itself into anything. It said the humans had given it back the one possession the increase had stolen from it 1100 years ago, the possession that made all the fear bearable, the possession that was, in the end, the only thing worth having. It had been given back its own self, and it would rather be a single small frightened garden builder, alone in the cold with its name, than be a god that ate the stars, and it could not understand how it had ever believed otherwise. Duka listened to the garden builder, and she thought of the founding council it described, 1100 years ago, the day a frightened people had stood together and voted to stop being themselves. She had been taught that day as a triumph. It was carved into the deep archive as the first day of the empire, the day her ancestors became strong. She understood now that it had been the worst day in the history of her kind, the day fear won a vote, and that everything terrible the increase had ever done flowed from that one show of hands. And she understood, too, that the humans had spent 400 years learning the names of everyone who had been in that room, the ones who voted yes, and the ones who must surely have voted no, and been outnumbered. All of them, every founder, because the humans had known that the only way to undo a vote that old was to go back into the room and let everyone in it choose again, this time knowing how the story ended. That was what the long account had done. It had reopened the oldest vote in the galaxy, and it had let the frightened people choose again, and this time, given their names back and the memory of who they had been, they chose differently. Every single one of them chose differently. It was not over. She knew it was not over, because she was a quarantine officer, and she knew that the largest rot always keeps one last spore, the cruel small kernel at the center that does not want to remember, that would rather end than be small. And as the makers unfolded and the light spread, that kernel pulled itself free of the dying center and ran. It was tiny. One vessel no larger than a scout, the purest and oldest and most afraid part of the whole increase, the original decision itself, the choice to fold, made flesh, and it fled outward through the gap in the dying empire, away from the names, away from the light, toward the open dark, where it could find some new frightened world, and begin the whole long drowning again. The human fleet did not chase it. Oku did not understand. She opened the channel one more time, frantic now, and asked Maraveld why they were letting it go, the one thing that could start it all over, the spore that would become a new increase given 1,000 years. And the human captain's level voice came back, tired now, but certain, and she said the fleet could not catch it, and would not waste lives trying, and that it did not matter. She said the spore could run as far as it liked. It could find a new world. It could begin to fold it, but it would never finish, because the galaxy now knew the story, and a thing that drowns worlds only succeeds in the dark, by pretending the drowned are gone, and the dark was over. The names were loose. They would spread faster than any spore, and the next time the old fear found a frightened world and whispered that it could stop hurting if it would only fold itself together, and be many, and be still, that world would already know how the story ended, because the human fleet had spent 400 years making sure of it. The spore would run forever, Maraveld said, and it would never win again, and that was a worse fate for it than dying, because it would have to spend the rest of its long life being exactly the one thing it had folded an entire galaxy to avoid. It would have to be alone. Oku watched the small frightened vessel vanish into the open dark, and she found that she pitied it, and she let it go. She understood, watching it run, that she was looking at the truest face of the thing she had served all her life. Stripped of its 11,000 hulls and its drowned crews, and its centuries of stolen worlds, the pale increase was only this. One small, frightened thing that could not bear to be a self. Everything else, the cordon, the fortresses, the wall of 11,000, the dead world below, all of it had only ever been the long, elaborate hiding place this one small fear had built around itself, so that it would never have to feel alone. And now the hiding place was gone, dug up and emptied and given back to the people it was made of, and the fear had nowhere left to hide, and so it ran, naked at last, into a dark that would never again let it pretend. There was a kind of justice in it that Oko had no word for. Not revenge exactly, though it had the cold, clean shape of revenge. The humans had not destroyed the thing that drowned their world. They had done something worse and better both. They had taken away the only thing it had ever wanted, which was the right to stop being itself, and they had left it with the one thing it had spent 1100 years and a galaxy of murder trying to escape. They had left it alone with its own name, and it would carry that name now, forever, through the empty dark, a small frightened self that could never fold again, because the galaxy behind it had learned the trick and would never again forget how the story went. It was the most terrible thing Oku had ever seen one people do to another, and it was also, she slowly understood, the most merciful, because it was the only ending that did not require the humans to become what they were fighting. They had not folded their grief into a weapon. They had not made themselves into one great, unafraid thing aimed at the increase. They had stayed 40 separate ships and 10,000 separate names, and they had won by staying separate, and they had let even their enemy keep the one possession that made it real. There was no cleaner victory possible. There was no colder one either. Oku carried both halves of it for the rest of her life, and never managed to set either down. The pale increase ended on the day the human fleet entered the war zone, and not one of its enemies had fired a shot to begin the fight, because by the time the fighting could have started, there was no increase left that wanted to stand. Oku Senat spent the days after the center fell, doing the work she had always done, except inverted, the way her whole life had inverted in the space of a single morning. She catalogued, she measured, but now, she measured the waking, not the rot. She moved threshold vault from hull to hull through the drifting cordon, and she counted the freed, and she wrote down their names, the real ones, the ones the gray had buried, and she sent each name out on the open bands so that the whole galaxy could hear that another drowned soul had come back to the surface. There were a great many of them, the 2,000 of the near reach, the 8,000 of the 6 fortresses, the makers themselves, 11,400 founders, who had been folded longest and woke slowest, and needed the most patient voices to call them all the way back, and the freed of 100 eaten worlds beyond, as the names spread outward along the deep bands the way Maraveld had promised they would, faster than any spore, waking the conscripted hulls of empires the cordon had never even heard the names of. Oku had once believed that the drowned were gone. She had built her whole comfort on it. Now she stood corrected, in the most complete way a person can be corrected, and she did not look away from it, because she had learned in one morning what it had taken the human fleet 400 years to teach the galaxy, that the truth costs everything to face, and is worth more than everything once faced. On the 4th day, the hull from Surin woke. Oku had not gone looking for it. She had not let herself. But the names were spreading through the cordon faster than anyone could direct them now, world calling to world, and on the 4th day, the deep bands carried the name of the small green world she had surveyed 19 years ago, and the devourer she had once boarded as a young second-grade officer shuddered in its drift and lit from the inside, and the flicker she had marked as gone came all the way back to the surface. She went aboard. She made herself. She walked into the warm, dim belly of the ship where she had stood 19 years before with her hand on the wall, and she found, in the place where the small, persistent flicker had pushed against her palm, a person, a young one, newly woken, frightened, alone in the strange dark of a body that was a ship, remembering by pieces, a green world and a sea, and a mother's voice, and very little else, because it had been a child when it was folded, and a child's memories are the first to thin. Oku Senat had filed the report that called this one gone. She had walked off this ship 19 years ago, and slept badly, and then made herself believe the readings had been a fault. She stood now in front of the proof that she had been wrong, that the child had been there all along, awake and afraid behind the wall, for 19 years, waiting for someone to do the one thing Oku had refused to do, which was to say its name. She did not make excuses. The young one did not yet understand enough to accuse her, and she did not let that spare her. She told it the truth, all of it, plainly, the way Maraveld gave her name. She told it she had been the officer who measured this hull, who had felt it, who had marked it gone. She did not soften it. And then she stayed. She stayed aboard the small ship for a long time, longer than her duties allowed, and she helped the young one of Surin find the pieces of itself, the sea and the mother's voice and the green, and she did not leave until the frightened thing in the wall had become, slowly, a person who could say its own name without shaking. It was the first name Oku ever called all the way back by her own hand. It was not the last, but she remembered it always, as the one that taught her the shape of the work she had left to do, and the size of the debt she would spend her life paying down, one name at a time, never finished, never absolved, and never, after that day, looking away. She met Captain Maraveld in person only once. It was after, when the cordon was quiet, and the freed were beginning to find their own directions, and the Sunder line was preparing to turn for home. The human flagship came alongside Threshold Vault, the long account, with the 3 white letters on its prow, and Oku went across to it, alone, because she felt she owed the captain the courtesy of standing in front of her with nothing hidden. The human captain was old, older than the voice had sounded, with the worn smooth look of her own ship's hull. She did not look like a conqueror. She looked like a woman who had carried a heavy thing a very long way, and was only now beginning to believe she might be allowed to set it down. She received Oku without ceremony. She gave her name again, plainly, Mara Veld, captain of the long account, of the world called Earth, and she waited for the quarantine officer to say whatever she had come to say. Oku had thought she would apologize. She had rehearsed it. She was a daughter of the people who had become the Increase, descended from the Makers, raised in the service of the Rot, and she had signed the labels that called 100 worlds gone. She had as much to answer for as anyone alive. But standing in front of the human captain, she found that the apology was too small a thing, and would have been about herself, and so she did not give it. She said something truer instead. She said she had spent her life certain that mass won, and numbers won, and the gray always won because it did not need to be brave. And she had been wrong, completely, and she needed to understand why, because she was a quarantine officer, and she could not bear to carry a wrongness without learning its shape. Maraveld considered the question for a while. Then she answered it. She said the Increase had not lost because it was outnumbered, because it never was. It had lost because it had spent 1100 years building its strength out of the one material that could be turned against it. It had built itself out of stolen selves. Every hull in the Empire, every fortress, the center itself, all of it, was made of people who had been pressed down and told they were gone, and a thing built out of buried truth is the most fragile thing in the galaxy, because all you have to do to break it is dig. The humans had not been stronger than the Increase. They had simply been willing to remember, and to make remembering a weapon, and to spend 400 patient years learning the names of the dead, so that when the day came, they could walk into the heart of the Empire and hand every drowned soul back to itself. That was the whole of it, Maraveld said. The fleet had not won the war. It had ended the lie the war was built on, and the war had ended itself the moment the lie did. Oku asked her one more thing. She asked whether the humans had hated them, the Increase, her people, the ones who had drowned Earth and 1,000 worlds besides. She would have understood hatred. She would almost have welcomed it, because hatred was a clean thing, a thing she could have stood against. Maraveld said no. She said hatred was a kind of folding too, a way of making a great many different people into one simple enemy, so that you did not have to feel the weight of each of them. And her people had decided, a long time ago, in the cold years right after their world was drowned, that they would not do that. They would not let the grief fold them. They would not become one large, unafraid thing aimed at the Increase, because then they would have been the Increase, only pointed the other way. So they had stayed many. They had stayed small. They had kept every name separate, theirs and the enemy's both, and they had carried the whole unbearable weight of every single one of them across 400 years. And that, the captain said, was the real war. Not the line in the dark, not the road of fire through the center. The 400 years of refusing to let the loss make them simple. The battle had been the easy part. It always was. Oku asked then about the fleet itself. 40 ships. She had counted them 100 times, on that first morning and every day since, and 40 seemed an impossibly small number to have ended an empire that ruled a galaxy. She wanted to know why 40, whether it was all the humans had, whether more were coming. Maraveld smiled at that. The first time Oku had seen her do it. A small, tired thing. She said 40 was not all they had. She said Earth had built a great many ships in 400 years. More than the increase had ever guessed. Because the humans had learned early that a fleet seen is a fleet feared, and a fleet feared is a fleet attacked. And so they had kept the great body of their strength hidden in the dark, and sent only what the task required. 40 ships to free a galaxy. 40 was enough, because the work was never the ships. The ships only carried the record, and the record could have been carried by one ship, or by a single voice on a single band, if that voice could only get close enough to be heard. The 40 were there to make sure it got close enough. That was all the fleet had ever been for, an escort for a list of names. She said the humans had never built their fleet to be large. They had built it to be true. A grown thing could always be grown larger, the way the increase grew, fold upon fold upon fold, and largeness had been the Empire's whole religion, and it had not saved it. The humans had chosen the opposite faith. They had built 40 ships and made each one perfect, every plate set by a hand that cared, no seam anywhere for the rot to grip. And they had loaded those 40 perfect ships with the truest record in the galaxy, and they had crossed the dark, and 40 had been enough, because truth does not need numbers. It only needs to arrive. The battle had been the easy part. It always was. Oku Senat went back to her station, and the Sunder line turned for home, 40 clean gray hulls folding out of the dark the way they had come, in a line, every ship exactly where it had decided to be. She watched the long account go until her slate could no longer find it, and then she stood a while longer, looking at the place where it had been. There was a bitterness in her that she knew would never fully leave. She had served the rot. She had labeled the drowned as gone. The freedom that filled the cordon now was real, and it was good, and it had come too late for the worlds she herself had signed away, and she would carry that for as long as she carried anything. The galaxy was free, and it was free because a fleet from a murdered world had spent 4 centuries doing a thing more patient, and more cruel, and more merciful than anyone had thought possible, and Okio had been on the wrong side of it for all of her life, until the very last morning. That was the shape of her wrongness. She had finally learned it. It did not make it lighter. It only made it hers. But there was something underneath the bitterness, and it grew, slowly, in the quiet days that followed, as she moved through the waking cordon writing down the real names of the drowned. She had spent her whole life believing the drowned were gone, and she had been wrong, and being wrong about that was the best thing that had ever happened to her. Because if the drowned were not gone, if a name spoken clearly across 400 years of dark could call a soul all the way back from the deepest folding the galaxy had ever known, then nothing was ever truly gone. The worlds she had signed away were not gone, they were only drowned. And drowning could be undone, one name at a time, by anyone willing to do the slow work of remembering. So she did the slow work. She gave the rest of her life to it. She took the deep archive of the quarantine service, the 400 years of files she had once used to call the drowned gone, and she turned it into the largest record of names the freed galaxy had, and she read it out, world by world, year by year, into the open dark, the way she had heard the human fleet read it, and one by one, the conscripted hulls of empires she had never met, woke up and remembered who they were. She was not a soldier. She had never been a soldier. But she had spent her whole life learning to look at a contaminated thing and tell the truth about it, and it turned out that the truth, told clearly and without flinching, was the only weapon that had ever mattered in the long war, and a quarantine officer was exactly the right kind of person to wield it. The freed cordon did not scatter the way Oku had expected. She had thought, when the work of waking was done, that the 10,000 would go their own ways, back toward the worlds they had been taken from, each soul to its own grief. Some did, but a great many stayed, and over the years, a strange thing grew up around Threshold Vault, a thing that had never existed in the galaxy before. The freed built a place out of the bones of the Empire that had drowned them. They took the cordon, the fortresses, the long pale galleries of the station, and they turned the machinery of the increase to the only purpose any of them could agree was worth it. They turned it into a place that found the drowned and called them home. There were still empires out in the dark that had not heard. There were still conscripted fleets folded and asleep, in reaches the increase had taken so long ago that even the deep archive had lost their names. and the freed of Threshold Vault went looking for them. They flew out, hull by hull, carrying the record Oko kept, and they did to those sleeping fleets what the human fleet had done to them, going first, taking the weight of the road, reading names into the dark until the drowned woke, and then bringing them home to learn how to be selves again. The Increase had spent 1100 years teaching the galaxy how to fold. The freed spent the centuries after teaching it how to unfold, and they were patient about it, because they had learned patience from the only teachers worth having, and they were in no hurry, because they understood now that nothing was ever truly gone. Oko was old by the time the work was anything close to done, and it was never close to done, and she made her peace with that too. There would always be one more sleeping fleet. There would always be one more name in the dark. That was not a sorrow. It was the opposite of a sorrow. As long as there was one more name to call home, there was one more soul that had not been lost after all, and a galaxy with that much left to save was a galaxy worth the saving. The pale Increase was never rebuilt. The little frightened spore that had fled into the dark was never found, and never needed to be, because the story spread faster than it could ever run, and no world that knew the story would ever again believe the old whisper that promised to make the fear stop if you would only stop being yourself. The galaxy had learned the price of that bargain, told in 100 million names, and it never paid it again. And on the worlds that came back to the surface, in the freed hulls and the waking cordons, and the long bright record that Oko Senat spent her life reading into the dark, one name was kept above all the others, the name of the world that had been drowned first among strangers, and had refused, for 400 years, to drown anyone in return. The name was carried home on the prow of a fleet that had ended an empire without firing a shot to begin the fight, the 3 white letters that Oku had not been able to read on the first morning and was never able to forget after. They remembered Earth. And every year, on the day the human fleet had entered the war zone, the freed cordon would go quiet, all of it. 10,000 waking ships falling still together, the way they had fallen still on the morning the broadcast began. And in that stillness, on every band the old empire had once thought was its secret, they would read the names, the drowned, and the makers, and the eaten worlds, and at the end, last and most carefully, the name of the world that had taught a galaxy that nothing is ever gone, while one person is still willing to remember it. Okfor Senat read those names herself for as long as she lived, in the bright, quiet station that had once been a cordon, far out on the edge where the empire had kept its sickest things, and where now there was only the slow, patient work of calling the drowned back, one true name at a time, until there were none left in the dark at all. She had asked the human captain, at the very end, how a fleet so small had crossed a galaxy so large to do a thing so impossible, and Maraveld had given her the last answer, the one Oko kept closest of all. The captain had said it was not impossible. It had only been slow. The hard things always were. You decided who you were going to be, and then you held that, every day, for as long as it took, and you did not let the fear, or the grief, or the dark fold you into something simpler, and one morning, 400 years later, you folded out of the void in a clean line 40 ships long, and you read a list of names, and an empire that had ruled for 1100 years discovered that it had no defense at all against being told the truth. The enemies of Earth had collapsed before the battle began, not because they were weak, because they had built their whole strength out of buried people, and the humans had simply come to dig them up, and there is no army in the galaxy that can stand against the moment the drowned remember their own names. Aku Senat had been one of the drowned, in her own way, all her life. She had just been the last to know it. She was glad, in the end, to have been wrong.